The water didn't disappear by accident. The first thing I heard that morning was the sound, a deep, hollow gurgle rolling under the concrete like something alive, like the ground itself was breathing. And by the time I stepped out onto my back porch, coffee still warm in my hand, the HOA's perfect little pool party had already started to unravel. Kids frozen mid-laugh, music cutting off in a confused stutter, and the bright blue water they'd been bragging about all summer was spiraling downward in a slow, unstoppable funnel. I didn't rush, didn't say a word, just leaned against the wooden rail my dad built 20 years ago and watched as the level dropped inch by inch, exposing tile that had never seen sunlight, because what they were finally seeing was mine. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 months earlier, I came back to this property expecting quiet, maybe a little dust, maybe the smell of old cedar and dry grass, the kind of place where time moves slower, but instead I got chlorine, laughter, and a 6-foot privacy fence I didn't recognize, wrapped around a full-scale in-ground pool sitting exactly where my father's garden used to be, right on the back half-acre that had been in our family since 1978. The smell hit me first, sharp and chemical, cutting through the Texas heat, followed by the echo of splashes and voices that didn't belong here. And when I pushed through that side gate, gravel crunching under my boots, I saw it, crystal clear water, deck chairs, umbrellas, a sign that read, Willow Creek Estates Community Pool, like they'd always owned it, like it had always been theirs. That's when I met Margaret Holloway, HOA president, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like she was inspecting a construction site instead of standing on someone else's land. Her voice smooth and practiced as she told me this was a community improvement project, that the previous owner had no objections, and that everything was properly approved. The kind of language designed to sound official without actually meaning anything. I remember the way the sun reflected off the water, blinding for a second, the laughter behind her, people who had no idea they were swimming in a mistake. And I remember thinking how easy it would have been to yell, to call the county right there, to shut it down before it even opened. But I didn't, because something didn't sit right, not with the fence line, not with the slope of the ground, not with the way the drainage ditch behind the pool had been covered up with fresh concrete like someone was trying to erase it. That night, I pulled out the old files, the ones my dad kept in a metal cabinet that still smelled like motor oil and paper dust, survey maps, permits, notes written in his handwriting, neat and precise. And that's when I found it. The original grading plan, the emergency runoff system he'd installed himself, tied directly into a manual release valve buried just inside our property line, designed to protect the land during heavy rain, something no HOA document could override because it wasn't part of their system. It was ours, always had been. The next morning, I went back out there, same pool, same laughter, same Margaret walking around like she owned the place, and I smiled, nodded, even thanked her for maintaining the property. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight right away. Sometimes you let people get comfortable, let them invest, let them build their routines and their expectations. Let them believe the story they've told themselves long enough that they forget to question it. All summer, I watched, the smell of sunscreen and chlorine drifting over my fence, the sound of weekend parties, kids cannonballing into water that didn't belong to them, HOA meetings bragging about increased property values, listings mentioning private community pool access, and every time I heard it, I thought about that valve, about the system hidden under their perfect concrete, waiting, patient, exactly where my dad left it. They thought ownership was about paperwork, about signatures and permits and board votes. But standing there that morning, watching the water sink lower, exposing the truth 1 inch at a time, I knew something they didn't, something Margaret was just starting to understand as her voice rose over the chaos, sharp and panicked, asking what was happening, asking who did this. And I finally stepped forward, boots hitting the pavement with a slow, deliberate rhythm, holding the original survey in my hand, the paper stiff and worn but still clear enough to show every boundary, every line, every inch of land that had never changed, no matter what they built on top of it. And I could feel the heat rising off the exposed concrete, hear the last of the water slipping away beneath the surface. And for the first time since I got back, the place felt quiet again, like it was remembering what it used to be. And I looked straight at her and said nothing, because I didn't need to, not yet. Margaret's voice kept rising behind me, sharp and strained. cutting through the hollow echo of water disappearing into something she could not see. And I could hear the shift in tone, that subtle crack when confidence starts to slip, when control is no longer guaranteed. But I did not turn around right away. I just walked past the pool edge slowly, boots scraping against the hot concrete, feeling the heat push through the soles, watching the last few inches of water slide away and expose the drain cover my father had installed decades ago, still perfectly centered, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. And for a second, I could almost smell the past over the chlorine, dry dirt, cut grass, the faint oil scent from his tools, memories layered under something they tried to erase with tile and fiberglass. 3 months earlier, none of this looked like a battleground. It looked like a mistake I needed to understand. And I remember standing there on that first night after finding the pool, the sky dark, cicadas humming in the trees, staring at the fence line with a flashlight in my hand, tracing where the original markers used to be, metal stakes my father drove into the ground himself, and realizing they were gone, pulled out clean, replaced with something newer, something aligned just enough to pass a casual glance, but wrong if you knew where to look. And that was the moment I stopped seeing this as an accident and started seeing it as a decision. I went to the county office the next morning, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air stale with paper and dust, and asked for every permit filed in the last 12 months for Willow Creek Estates. And what I got back was a stack that looked official at first glance, stamped, signed, approved, but the deeper I looked, the more gaps I saw, missing references, vague descriptions, nothing that clearly defined the exact boundary where that pool sat, like someone had drawn a map without ever measuring the land beneath it. The clerk behind the counter did not even look up when she handed it to me, just said everything checked out on their end, which told me everything I needed to know about how far this went. Because paperwork like that does not get approved by accident. It gets approved because nobody asks the right questions, or because the right people make sure those questions never get asked. I drove back home with the windows down, the heat rolling in, dust sticking to my skin, and I could still hear the laughter from the pool before I even turned onto my road. That easy, careless sound of people enjoying something they believed was theirs. And I remember thinking how quickly people accept a new reality when it benefits them, how fast a borrowed space becomes permanent in their minds. Margaret was waiting for me that afternoon, standing just inside the gate like she had been expecting a conversation, her posture straight, her expression calm again, like whatever had slipped earlier had already been pushed back into place, and she handed me a packet, printed, organized, full of HOA language about community rights and shared improvements. And I flipped through it slowly, feeling the thickness of the paper, the confidence in every page, and I nodded like I understood, like I accepted it, because in that moment, arguing would have been loud, obvious, and useless. What mattered was what they did not see, what they never thought to check, because while they were building up, I was looking down at the land itself, at the grading, at the way water moved after a storm, at the slight dip behind the pool where the soil never quite dried the same way, and every detail kept pointing back to one thing. The system my father built was still there, untouched beneath. Everything they added, a quiet piece of control buried under their assumptions. Weeks passed, then months, and I let it all happen. The grand opening, the ribbon cutting, the newsletter photos showing smiling families, the way Margaret's voice carried across the yard during HOA meetings, confident, polished, talking about community growth and rising values. And every time I heard it, I pictured the valve, metal worn smooth from years of use, sitting just inside my boundary, connected to everything they thought they owned. Back in the present, the pool was almost empty now, just a shallow layer left, sunlight reflecting off wet concrete instead of water, and the noise had shifted completely. No more laughter, just confused voices, footsteps, questions stacking on top of each other, and I could feel all of it without needing to look directly, because I had already seen how this would end the moment I found that original plan in my father's files. And as the final swirl of water slipped away into the ground, leaving behind nothing but a hollow basin and a truth they could no longer ignore, I finally turned back toward Margaret, the survey still in my hand, the lines clear, the boundary undeniable, and I watched her eyes move from the empty pool to the paper, then back to me, searching for something that was no longer there. Control, certainty, ownership, all of it draining just like the water beneath her feet. Margaret took a step toward me, heels clicking against the wet concrete with a sharp, uneven rhythm, the kind that told you she was trying to stay composed but could not quite hold it together. And for the first time since I met her, she did not start with a polished sentence. She started with a question that sounded almost uncertain, asking what I had done like she already knew the answer but needed me to say it out loud. And I let the silence sit between us for a second longer than necessary. Long enough for the people around the pool to start listening, long enough for the weight of the moment to settle in, because this was never just about water. It was about control, and control only works when nobody challenges it. I unfolded the survey slowly, the paper stiff from years in that metal cabinet, edges worn but the ink still sharp, every boundary line drawn with precision that did not care about fences or HOA votes or community plans, and I held it out just enough for her to see, not close enough to take, because this was not a document you handed over. This was something you showed, something you made people understand without touching, and I could see her eyes track the lines, the corners, the measurements, the exact placement of the structure that used to be full of water just minutes ago. This entire section, I said, my voice steady, carrying further than I expected in the sudden quiet, has always been mine. The air felt different without the sound of splashing, without the echo of music bouncing off the surface, just the faint drip of water sliding down tile and the distant hum of someone's phone still playing a song that no longer fit the scene. And behind her, people were starting to move, gathering their things, whispering to each other, trying to piece together what was happening without fully understanding it, because to them, this pool had been real, permanent, something they paid for, something they trusted, and now it was just concrete and confusion. Margaret straightened her posture, that practiced confidence snapping back into place like a reflex, and she shook her head once, slow and deliberate, like rejecting the reality in front of her could somehow make it go away, and she started talking again, faster this time, words stacking on top of each other, mentioning permits, approvals, community rights, all the same language she used before, but now it sounded thinner, stretched, like it did not quite fit the situation anymore. I listened without interrupting, because this part mattered, letting her say everything she needed to say, letting her build her argument in front of witnesses, because once it was all out there, once everyone heard it, it became something I could dismantle piece by piece without raising my voice. When she finally paused, expecting a response, I stepped a little closer, the heat from the exposed concrete rising between us, and I pointed to a section on the survey, a small notation most people would have missed, something buried in technical language that only made sense if you knew what to look for. You built over a private drainage system, I said, keeping it simple, watching her expression shift again, not confusion this time, something closer to realization, because she understood enough to know that certain things cannot be overridden by a board decision or a signed form. I explained it the way my father explained things to me, direct and grounded, no extra words, that the system beneath the pool was designed to control runoff for this entire section of land, that it was registered long before the HOA existed, and that the manual release point, the one that controlled everything, sat entirely within my property line, untouched by any of their changes, untouched because they never knew it was there. A breeze moved through the area, carrying the sharp scent of chlorine mixed with damp concrete, and I could see people starting to connect the dots, glancing from the empty pool to me, to Margaret, to the ground beneath their feet, like it suddenly meant something different. She tried to interrupt, tried to regain control of the conversation, but it did not land the same way anymore, because control depends on certainty, and certainty had just drained out in front of everyone. I did not raise my voice, did not step back, just stayed where I was and let the facts settle, because this was the part most people miss, the part where you do not need to push, you just need to let reality do the work for you. You can build anything you want, I said finally, looking at the empty basin behind her, but that does not make it yours. The words hung there, simple, clear, and for a moment, nobody said anything, not even Margaret, because there was nothing left to argue without stepping into territory she could not control, and as the last drops of water slid into the drain beneath us, leaving nothing but silence and exposed truth, I could see it in her face, the exact moment she realized this was not a misunderstanding, not a dispute she could smooth over with paperwork or meetings, but something much harder to deal with. something that had been there long before she ever decided to build anything on top of it. Margaret's lips parted like she was about to respond, but nothing came out at first, just a thin breath that caught in the dry heat rising off the empty basin. And for a second, the only sound left was the faint ticking of cooling concrete and water dripping somewhere deep below, a slow, hollow echo that made the whole space feel unfinished, exposed, like something important had been peeled back too quickly. And I could see it in the way people shifted around the edges, gathering towels, picking up chairs, avoiding eye contact with her now, because the authority she carried all summer did not look the same without that water behind her. She tried again, this time firmer, saying they had invested in this, that the HOA had contracts, that families depended on this space. And the way she said it, like obligation could rewrite ownership, like use could replace truth, almost made it sound convincing if you did not know where to look. But I had spent the last 3 months looking exactly where it mattered, and I knew every inch beneath that surface better than anyone standing there. I stepped to the edge of the basin and crouched slightly, running my hand along the tile where the water line used to sit, the surface still slick, still holding the faint smell of chlorine, and I pointed toward the center where the drain sat exposed now, a circular piece of metal that had not seen daylight in years, quiet and ordinary until you understood what it controlled. You built over something you never checked, I said, not raising my voice, just letting it carry in the still air, and I could feel the attention shift again, people turning back, listening despite themselves, because uncertainty pulls harder than confidence ever does. Margaret followed my gesture, her eyes narrowing, calculating, trying to piece together what she missed, and I watched that realization build slowly, layer by layer, because this was not just a legal problem for her. It was a structural one, something physical, something already done, and that kind of mistake does not get fixed with a meeting or a memo. I stood back up and unfolded another sheet from the folder, this one newer, printed clean, the kind of document that does not leave room for interpretation, and I held it out just enough for her to read the header, county records, updated verification of boundary lines and registered utility systems, dated 2 weeks ago, stamped and signed in a way that even she could not dismiss. I gave you the whole summer, I said, and this time there was a shift in my tone, not louder, just clearer, like drawing a line you had already decided on long before anyone else noticed, because I wanted everything documented exactly as it is. The words settled heavier than anything I had said so far, and I saw it land, not just on her, but on everyone listening, because suddenly this was not about a misunderstanding. It was about intent, about patience, about a decision made long before today. She took a step back without realizing it, her heel catching slightly on the damp surface, and she glanced around like she was looking for support that was no longer there, because the crowd had changed, no longer on her side, no longer part of a shared space, just individuals standing in a place that did not belong to them anymore. You cannot just shut this down, she said, but it came out weaker this time. More like a question than a command, and I shook my head once, slow and certain, because that was the one thing I could do. I did not shut anything down, I replied, meeting her eyes directly. I used what is mine. The breeze picked up again, carrying dust across the exposed concrete, soft grains brushing against my boots, and I could hear someone in the background making a phone call, their voice low, urgent, trying to bring in someone else, someone with authority. But authority only works when it stands on something solid, and right now, everything they had built was resting on a mistake. I walked past her then, not in a rush, just steady, toward the edge of the property where the old boundary marker should have been, and I stopped at the spot where I had already measured twice, already confirmed, and I drove a new metal stake into the ground earlier that morning before anyone arrived, the sound of it, still fresh in my memory, that clean, final note of steel meeting earth, marking something that should have never been moved in the first place. I tapped it lightly with my boot now, drawing attention to it without saying much, because the visual said enough, a simple line in the ground that no one could argue with anymore. Behind me, the empty basin sat silent, stripped of everything that made it feel like a community space, reduced to what it really was, a structure built in the wrong place. And as I turned back one last time, I could see Margaret standing there, no clipboard, no confident stance, just a person trying to figure out how something so certain had shifted so completely, And I knew this was not the end of it, not yet, because people like her do not walk away quietly, but the foundation of her control had already been removed, and without that, everything else was just noise waiting to fade. The first police cruiser rolled in 10 minutes later, tires crunching slow over gravel like it was unsure where it had just arrived, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know before the officer even stepped out, because situations like this only look simple from a distance, and up close, with an empty pool and 50 people watching, nothing about it was simple anymore. The door opened with a dull click, and Officer Daniels stepped out, one hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning the scene the way someone does when they are trying to separate noise from facts. And the moment his gaze landed on the drained basin, I saw the same calculation I had already gone through hours earlier, the silent question of what exactly had happened here and who actually had the authority to answer it. Margaret moved fast, heels snapping sharp again as she closed the distance between them, her voice back to that controlled urgency, explaining, framing, guiding the narrative before anyone else could speak, using words like vandalism and destruction, pointing toward the empty pool like it had been attacked instead of revealed, and I let her talk, because this part mattered more than anything she had said earlier. This was where stories got recorded, where first impressions turned into official ones if you did not let them play out fully. Daniels nodded once, listening, not interrupting, his expression neutral but not convinced, and when she finally paused, he looked past her, straight at me, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because attention had moved from the person with the loudest voice to the person who had not needed to raise theirs at all. I stepped forward slowly, boots steady on the rough surface, the folder still in my hand, and I could feel the heat rising stronger now that the sun had climbed higher, pressing down on everything, making the air feel thicker, heavier, like even the environment understood something had changed. "This is my property," I said, keeping it simple, holding out the survey and the updated county verification without adding anything extra, because clarity beats volume every time. And he took the papers, flipping through them with practiced speed, eyes moving line to line, checking stamps, dates, signatures, the small details that cannot be faked without leaving a mark. Margaret tried to interject, adding context, adding pressure, but he raised a hand just slightly, not dismissive, just enough to signal that he needed a moment to process. And that small gesture landed harder than anything else so far, because it was the first time her control did not immediately redirect the situation. The sound of paper shifting was loud in the quiet, pages turning, the faint scratch of his thumb against the edges, and I watched his posture change almost imperceptibly, the way it does when information starts to settle into place and the picture becomes clearer than whatever was said out loud. "You are saying the structure was built on your land?" he asked, not looking up yet, just confirming, and I nodded once, then pointed toward the exposed drain at the center of the basin. "And over a registered drainage system that I control," I added, letting that detail sit, because it was not just about land, it was about function, about something active, something already used, something they had interfered with without understanding it. He looked up then, following my gesture, taking in the empty space, the dry concrete, the visible infrastructure that had been hidden all summer, and then back to the documents in his hand, and I could see the conclusion forming before he even spoke, because once you align physical evidence with verified records, there is not much left to argue. Margaret's voice came in again, sharper now, pushing back, insisting that permits had been approved, that the HOA had legal standing, that the community relied on this, and there it was again, that attempt to turn usage into ownership, to turn belief into fact. But Daniels did not move the same way anymore, did not shift toward her explanation. He stayed where he was, grounded in what he could verify, not what he was told. "Do you have documentation showing the exact boundary used for this construction?" he asked her, calm, direct, and for the first time, she hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for everyone to notice, because hesitation is louder than any confident answer. She reached for her folder, flipping through pages quickly, the sound more frantic than organized, and I did not need to see what was inside to know it would not match what I had already provided, because I had already checked everything they filed, every permit, every vague description that avoided precise lines. The sun reflected off the dry surface behind her, bright and unforgiving, and the space that used to look like a centerpiece now looked like evidence, something fixed in place that could not be explained away. Daniels closed my folder gently, handing it back with a nod that was small but clear, and then he stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both of us, not taking sides, just acknowledging what stood in front of him. At this point, he said, his voice even, measured, this appears to be a property boundary issue with supporting documentation indicating this area belongs to him. The words settled into the air with a finality that no raised voice could compete with, and for a second, nobody spoke, because once something like that is said out loud, especially by someone in uniform, it becomes harder to ignore, harder to twist into something else. Margaret's shoulders tightened, her posture still upright but no longer steady, and I could see it. The realization setting deeper now, not just that she had made a mistake, but that the system she relied on was no longer backing her the way it always had. And as the crowd continued to thin, people leaving with quiet conversations and uncertain glances, the space around the empty basin felt wider, quieter, like it was resetting itself, returning to something closer to what it had been before. All of this started, and I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something solid, something that did not need to be pushed any further, because the truth was already doing the work for me. The crowd thinned faster after that, not all at once, but in quiet pieces, chairs folding, towels slung over shoulders, conversations dropping to low murmurs that carried just enough to tell me people were already choosing sides without saying it out loud, and the space around the empty basin felt bigger with every step someone took away from it, like the illusion that had filled it all summer was finally clearing out with them. Officer Daniels stayed where he was for a moment longer, looking from the exposed drain to the boundary stake I had set earlier, then back to Margaret, giving her one last chance to present something solid, something that could stand next to what he had already seen, but she did not have it, and we all knew it. She tried again, voice steadier now but quieter, talking about board approvals, about how the community relied on shared amenities, about how this could not just be undone in a morning. And there was something different in the way she said it this time. Less command, more negotiation, like she was testing a new angle that might still give her something to hold on to. Daniels listened, hands relaxed at his sides, then gave a small nod that did not agree or disagree, just acknowledged, and he stepped back toward his cruiser, the gravel crunching under his boots as he spoke into his radio, reporting it as a civil matter with documented boundaries, the kind of phrasing that closes doors without slamming them. When he pulled away a few minutes later, the engine noise faded quickly, leaving behind a kind of quiet that felt earned, like the land itself was settling back into place. Margaret remained near the edge of the basin, staring down at the exposed concrete like it might shift if she waited long enough, and I could see the calculations still running behind her eyes, options narrowing, pressure building, because people like her do not stop at the first answer they do not like. They look for another path, another angle, another way to reframe what just happened. She turned to me slowly, the edge in her voice replaced by something more measured, more careful, asking what it would take to fix this, to work something out. And the phrase landed exactly how I expected, like a late offer after a decision had already been made. I walked a few steps closer, stopping at the line where the new stake met the old path, and I looked down at the ground for a second before answering, feeling the texture of packed dirt under my boot, the same ground that had been there long before any of this. And I thought about my father standing here years ago, explaining why he set things up the way he did, not for control, but for protection, for clarity, for moments exactly like this. You start by acknowledging where the line actually is, I said, not harsh, just direct, and I watched her take that in, watched the way her shoulders shifted slightly as she realized this was not something she could talk around anymore. She asked about refilling the pool, about restoring it, about bringing things back to how they were yesterday, and I shook my head once, slow, because yesterday was built on a mistake, and there is no restoring something that was never right to begin with. The system under there stays active, I said, nodding toward the drain, and anything built over it without my consent does not stay. The words were simple, but they carried everything I had already proven, everything that had already played out in front of her, and for a moment, she did not respond, just stood there with the sun reflecting off the dry surface behind her, the bright light making the empty space look even more final. A few remaining. Neighbors lingered at a distance, watching without stepping in, their presence quieter now, more cautious, because the dynamic had shifted from shared enjoyment to something personal, something legal, something they could not influence just by being there. Margaret finally nodded once, a small movement that did not concede everything but admitted enough, and she said she would bring it to the board, that they would review everything, that they would address the situation, and I could hear the structure returning to her words, the formal language she relied on, but it did not carry the same weight anymore, not after what had just happened in plain view. I stepped back then, giving her space, not because I needed to, but because the next move was not mine to make in that moment. I had already done what mattered, already set the facts in place, and as I turned toward the house, the faint smell of chlorine still hanging in the air mixed with dust and warm earth, I could feel the shift settle deeper, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like something that had always been there finally being recognized again. Behind me, the basin remained empty, the drain quiet now after doing its job, and I knew this was not over, not by a long shot, because systems like hers do not collapse in a single morning, but they do crack, and once a crack starts, it does not stop spreading, especially when it runs along a line that was always there, waiting to be seen. The next morning started quieter than I expected. No music, no splashing, just the low hum of early traffic in the distance and the soft creak of my porch steps as I stepped outside with a cup of coffee that tasted a little stronger than usual, like the day needed it. And when I looked out toward the basin, it was still there, unchanged, a wide stretch of dry concrete catching the morning sun, shadows stretching across it like lines that had finally settled into place. But what caught my attention was not the emptiness, it was the movement around it, a small group gathered near the edge, not the usual crowd, not families with towels and kids, but a different kind of presence, clipboards, measuring wheels, people in neutral. Colors who did not belong to weekend routines, and I knew before I got closer that Margaret had already made her move. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked down, the air cooler but already carrying that faint leftover scent of chlorine mixed with dust, and as I approached, one of the men looked up, nodding slightly like he had been expecting me, which told me everything about who had called them in and what kind of response she was trying to build. "We are here to assess the structure," he said, voice even, professional, the kind that stays in the middle no matter what it sees, and I nodded back, not slowing down, because I had already been through this part in my head, already mapped out where this would go the moment she said she would bring it to the board. Margaret stood a few feet behind them, arms crossed, posture tight, not the confident stance from before, but not defeated either, something in between, recalibrating, and when our eyes met, there was no greeting, no attempt at small talk, just a quiet acknowledgement that the next phase had started. The measuring wheel rolled across the concrete with a steady clicking sound, counting distance, confirming what I already knew, and I watched them move toward the center, toward the drain, their attention sharpening as they took in the details that had been hidden all summer, and one of them crouched down, brushing his hand over the metal cover, tracing the edges like he was reading a language written in steel and placement. "This ties into an older runoff system," he said to the others, not asking, just stating, and I saw the small shift in their posture, the way professionals react when something is not just surface level, when it connects to something deeper, something that has its own rules. Margaret stepped forward then, her voice measured but carrying that underlying urgency again, explaining that the pool was a community investment, that permits had been approved, that this was a misunderstanding that needed to be corrected, and I let her speak, because I knew exactly what they would ask next, because I had asked it myself weeks ago in a different office under different lights. "Do you have documentation showing the integration with existing infrastructure?" one of them asked, looking directly at her, and there it was, the same question, the same line she could not cross without stepping into something she did not control, and I watched her hesitate again, just for a second, before she reached for her folder, flipping through pages that sounded thinner now, less certain. I stepped closer, just enough to place my own documents on the edge of the basin, the paper catching a slight breeze, and I pointed to the section that mattered, the registered system, the original plan, the verification from the county that tied everything together, and I did not need to say much, because the alignment between what they were seeing and what I was showing was already doing the work. The man crouched by the drain glanced up at me, then at the documents, then back at the structure, and I saw it again, that quiet conclusion forming. The same one Daniels had reached the day before, but this time with a different weight, because this was not just about a moment. This was about what came next. If this system remains active, he said, standing up slowly, anything built over it without proper clearance becomes a liability. And the word hung in the air longer than anything else, because liability is not something you argue away. It is something that follows you, something that spreads through contracts, insurance, responsibility. Margaret's arms tightened across her chest, her gaze fixed on the basin like she was trying to hold it together through will alone. But I could see the shift, deeper now, not just public, not just visual, but structural, the kind that affects decisions behind closed doors. I picked up my papers and stepped back, giving them space to continue their assessment, the sound of their tools and quiet conversations filling the gap where laughter used to be, and as I turned slightly toward the house, I could feel it settling in again, that same steady clarity from the day before, not loud, not dramatic, just firm, because this was never about a single moment, it was about a line that had always been there. And now everyone who needed to see it, finally, did. By the third day, the silence around that basin had turned into something heavier, not empty anymore, but watchful, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of the story would survive. And I could feel it the moment I stepped outside again. The air still, no music, no movement, just the faint rustle of papers in the distance and the low murmur of voices that stopped whenever I got too close. Because now this was not just about a pool, it was about lines people had never thought to question before. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for that evening, and you could tell by the way people moved during the day, doors opening slower, conversations happening just out of sight, that everyone knew it mattered more than any meeting they had before, because this time the outcome was not about paint colors or fence heights. It was about ownership, liability, and something far harder to ignore once it was exposed. I did not attend right away. I stayed back, sitting on my porch as the sun dipped lower, the sky turning that deep orange that always made this place feel calm no matter what was happening. And I could hear the distant hum of cars heading toward the clubhouse, tires rolling over pavement in a steady stream, carrying people who had spent all summer believing one thing and were about to hear something very different. When I finally walked down, the lights inside were already bright, spilling out across the parking lot. And through the glass I could see the room packed tighter than I had ever seen it, rows of chairs filled, people standing along the walls, all facing the front where Margaret stood behind a table, papers laid out in front of her like a shield she was still trying to rebuild. The air inside felt warmer, thicker, carrying the scent of coffee and tension, and the moment I stepped in, conversations dropped just enough to notice, not silent, but quieter, like the room had shifted its focus without announcing it. Margaret started speaking as soon as the last few people settled, her voice controlled, measured, outlining the situation in terms that tried to keep it contained, referring to it as a boundary. Clarification issue, avoiding the word mistake, avoiding anything that sounded like fault, but the words did not land the same way anymore, not after what everyone had already seen with their own eyes. She talked about permits, about intentions, about community benefit, and I watched the room, not her, because the reactions mattered more than the speech, the small shifts, the crossed arms, the glances between neighbors, the quiet skepticism that builds when reality does not match what you are being told. Then she brought up the assessment report, the one from the inspectors earlier that day, and that was where everything changed again, because once that document was read out loud, there was no room left to soften it, no way to reframe it into something harmless. The structure is built over an active, privately controlled drainage system, she read. The words steady but the tone just a fraction tighter than before, and cannot remain operational without full compliance with the registered property owner's authorization. The room did not erupt. It did something quieter, something more decisive, a wave of low conversation that spread from row to row, not loud but certain, because once you hear something like that, especially from a third party, it becomes real in a way nothing else does. Someone in the back asked about liability, another about insurance, another about property value disclosures, and suddenly the conversation was no longer about keeping the pool. It was about risk, about consequences, about what this meant going forward, and Margaret could not redirect it anymore, because the focus had shifted beyond her control. I stayed near the back, not speaking, just listening as the questions stacked, each one pulling the situation further away from what it had been and closer to what it actually was. And for the first time, I saw members of the board looking at each other instead of at her, silent exchanges that said more than any vote. When they finally called for a motion, it came from someone who had not said much before, a quiet voice near the middle of the room, suggesting immediate suspension of the pool's operation and a full legal review of the construction. And the way it was said, calm, practical, almost reluctant, carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not emotional, it was inevitable. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it did not need to be, it only needed enough, and as hands went up, one after another, I could feel the shift lock into place, not dramatic, not loud, just final in its own steady way. Margaret lowered her gaze for a second after it passed, just a second, before straightening again. But that brief moment was enough to show everything that had changed, and as the meeting moved on to what they called next steps, the room already knew the direction things were going. I stepped back out into the cooler night air before it ended, the sounds of the meeting fading behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling again. And as I walked past the path that led to the empty basin, I did not need to look, because I already knew what was there, and more importantly, what was not. And for the first time since this started, it felt like the line that had always existed beneath everything had finally been recognized by everyone who needed to see it. The morning after the meeting felt different in a way that did not need to be announced, like the air itself had settled into a new understanding, quieter but clearer. And when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was not what had changed, but what had stopped. No maintenance crew, no early morning chatter, no sound of gates opening. Just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a neighborhood returning to something more honest. The basin sat exactly where it had been, wide and empty under the rising sun. But now it no longer looked like something broken. It looked like something resolved, like the final page of a story that had been written long before anyone tried to change it. I walked down slowly, boots pressing into the dry dirt along the edge where grass had already started to reclaim the line they once covered. And the faint scent of chlorine was almost gone now, replaced by something more familiar, warm earth, sun on concrete, the kind of smell that belongs to land that is not trying to be anything else. There were new markers in place, clean, visible, not hidden or adjusted, just set where they always should have been, and that alone told me more than any document could about how the board had decided to move forward, because people only make lines visible when they intend to respect them. Margaret was already there when I reached the edge, standing a few feet from the basin, no clipboard, no crowd, just her and a folder held loosely at her side. And for the first time since this started, she did not speak immediately. She just looked out across the empty space, taking it in without trying to control it. When she finally turned, her expression was different, not defeated, not angry, just measured in a way that felt real, like she had spent the night adjusting to something she could not change. The board voted to remove the structure, she said, voice steady, direct, no extra framing, no softening, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything she had said before. I nodded once, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement, because this was not a negotiation anymore, it was a conclusion. She explained the next steps, contractors coming in to dismantle the pool, engineers reviewing the underlying system to ensure nothing had been damaged, insurance claims being filed, legal consultations already underway, each word grounded in process instead of persuasion. And I listened the same way I had from the beginning, quietly, letting the facts stand on their own. There was a pause after she finished, not awkward, just open, like both of us understood that something had ended here, even if the cleanup would take weeks. You could have stopped it before it was built, she said after a moment, not accusing, just stating something that had probably been sitting with her all night. And I looked out at the basin again before answering, feeling the warmth of the sun rising higher, the light spreading evenly across the surface that had once reflected something else entirely. Stopping it early would have been loud, I said, keeping my voice even, but letting it play out made it clear. She nodded slightly, like she understood the difference now, the weight of visibility versus argument, and for the first time, there was no pushback, no attempt to redirect, just acceptance of how it unfolded. A light breeze moved across the area, carrying the faint sound of distant construction from another part of the neighborhood, life continuing in places untouched by this, and I could feel something settle deeper, not satisfaction, not victory, just a quiet alignment between what was and what had always been true. She turned to leave after that, walking back toward the path without looking over her shoulder, and I stayed where I was, watching the empty basin one more time, not because I needed to, but because it marked something that would not be repeated, a line tested, and then restored in a way no meeting or rule could replicate. The contractors arrived later that afternoon, trucks rolling in with a steady rumble, equipment unloading with metallic clanks that echoed differently now without water to absorb the sound, and I watched from a distance as they began the process of undoing what had been built in the wrong place. Each piece removed not out of anger, but out of necessity, methodical, deliberate, the way things should have been handled from the start. Days turned into weeks, the concrete broken down, the materials hauled away, the ground beneath it revealed again in layers, until eventually, what remained was not a basin but a stretch of land that matched the original survey exactly. Every inch accounted for, every line respected. Grass came back slowly, first in patches, then more evenly, soft green replacing the hard edges that had dominated the space all summer, and the drainage system remained, quiet, functional, exactly as it had been designed, doing its job without needing to be seen. People still walked past sometimes, slowing for a second, looking at the area like they were trying to reconcile what they remembered with what stood there now, but over time, even that faded, replaced by new routines, new conversations, the neighborhood adjusting to a version of itself that was built on something more solid. I stood there one evening as the sun dipped low again, the light stretching across the restored ground, and I realized something simple, something that had been there from the start. Ownership is not about what you build, it is about what you understand, what you protect, and what you are willing to stand on when everything else shifts, and in the end, nothing had been taken, nothing had been destroyed, it had just been returned to what it always was. And that kind of correction does not need noise, it just needs time, clarity, and the patience to let the truth surface on its own.